Hello everyone, welcome to Longarming by Jaclyn. It's December 10th. The long arm is nude. We are between jobs here. So I'm going to shoot a couple of things. It'll probably be split into a couple of videos and we'll see how it all falls out. So we're just going to have a little tea break, get ourselves together, take advantage of an empty studio for just a breath. It is such a busy season, starting a little bit before Thanksgiving all the way right up to before Christmas in the long arm studio. So the first thing I want to talk about is contrast. And I think I've made videos about this before, but this is something when it comes to designing your quilt and selecting your fabrics that a lot of people have questions about, or they're like really intimidated about it and they want to know more about how to do that, but they don't know who to ask or how to ask. So if you feel like you are stuck using kits or already sort of following just the recommended fabrics for a particular pattern, if you buy a pattern and you have spent that money, you should be able to get literally thousands of different looking quilts out of that one pattern by choosing your colors and your fabrics differently to go with it. So I think the main thing you need to decide when you're pairing fabrics to go into a quilt is, do you want to soften it or do you want to show it? So if you want to soften the design, see less of the piecing, make it more sort of camouflage, muted, then you want to move to a softer level of contrast. If you want to see the piecing, like this quilt behind me, it's a pretty traditional design, and the story of this quilt is largely about the piecing. So you're not really seeing the details of what's going on in this fabric because it's cut pretty small. So what you're seeing is the contrast between the fabrics is bringing that piecing forward to see. And like, you really don't get a lot of quilting. You know, there's nice quilting in there, and if I lit it from the side and filmed it, you would see it. But the story of this quilt is not really about the quilting. So if you want the story of your quilt to be about the piecing, and usually if you're making tops, you do want that, then you want to have enough contrast that you see it. I made a really lively tone-on-tone jelly roll race style quilt. I'll try to find a picture of it. And that one was not about the fabrics and not really about the piecing. It was sort of about an overall soft texture. So I used similar fabrics. They did not have a lot of contrast. It doesn't really matter where the fabrics sort of blend and merge into the next one. And that one was more about sort of a soft textural color story. So I went low contrast, and you really don't even really see the piecing. The piecing of a jelly roll race is kind of not the point. It's not the vibe. But a quilt like this, you're doing quite a bit of cutting of these small pieces and arranging them in a particular way. So to do all that work and not see any of it is kind of a waste. So let's talk about some things that you can do to either bring your contrast up or bring your contrast down. So when you're grouping fabrics and you're trying to find what category they go into, if you are struggling to place the fabrics into one of, say, 2 categories, 3 categories, whatever number of color groups your pattern calls for, if you're struggling to figure out if it's A or B, then your eyeball and your customer's eyeball or your giftee's eyeball is also going to struggle to tell that. So it should be a clear distinction. If you're like, it's here, no, it's there, no, it's here, it's neither. Just because you love a fabric, because a fabric maybe coordinates with the other fabrics in your quilt, doesn't mean it's the right one to deploy to tell your story and to make your piecing pop. So the fabric is not sad. The fabric is not feeling judged that it's going back into the stash and not being used for this particular quilt. You know, you eyes on the price, focus on the finished product, and if it's not the right fabric to tell that story and to help that piecing pop and to get into that category, you don't have to use it. And it's not going to be offended. You're not going to hurt its feelings. So just out. Take it out. If you cannot clearly tell what group it's in, it's out. The other thing we need to talk about a little bit is scale. If you have a large scale print, especially if you have small scale piecing, you're not going to be able to read that large scale print. The other thing, so here's my example. If I were looking at a large piece of this, you would say this is probably a light blue fabric. If I were to just say, what color? And you give your immediate instinct as to what color. But if I'm cutting this into a small triangle and you get this piece, then that is a dark red triangle. So as you're cutting a fabric with a large scale print like this, if you want to see the story that the fabric is telling, then you need to use a big enough piece of fabric that it becomes about the fabric. It's less about the piecing. It's more about the fabric at this point. And you need to cut it in such a way that it's going to feature the scale of this fabric. But if you're looking to contrast this fabric, and let's say your cut is right here, the fabric that I put next to this background to see good contrast is not necessarily going to contrast when the bird comes close to the edge of that fabric. So that's going to muddy the transition. So do I want to soften the transition and sort of blur where this fabric transitions into another fabric? Or do I want to make it more sharp, make it pop, and really see the boundary of where that piecing, and let the piecing tell the story? So if I want the piecing to pop, then I'm going to avoid fabrics like this that sort of have all the colors. This might be the anchor fabric or the inspiration fabric for my quilt where I'm pulling colors from it, but I might not necessarily use this everywhere. This might appear in a wide border or a backing where I can appreciate the bigger story that this fabric is telling, and that portion of the quilt is about the fabric. But in my smaller, more intricate piecing, I'm definitely not going to use this because I, in my mind, want to treat this as a light blue fabric, but it's a black fabric, it's a red fabric, it's a dark blue fabric, it's a yellow fabric. So what do I put against this to contrast? It's a green fabric. It's every color fabric. So if I want contrast, I'm going to avoid large scale and multicolor. This one's a little bit softer, and it's limiting its color palette a little bit. That doesn't mean I can't use this fabric in a more balanced finished quilt that has colors that are a little bit more representing the whole color wheel, and it looks balanced in the end. But if every fabric is balanced, then you won't see the difference between them. So each fabric sort of needs to stick to its own lane. This fabric sticks to its own lane a little bit more as far as the color palette. We're cool, we're venturing a little bit into the peaches lightly, but it's sort of sticking to the blue. And if I cut this small, it's still giving me mostly dark blue vibes. But if I have a pattern that's fairly busy and is pulling a wider array of colors, and I put it against another pattern that's fairly busy, a fairly large scale, and pulling from a lot of colors, and then even though this fabric is reading pretty soft, pretty yellow, I would say this is, in most quilts, this would be a medium. And even though it's got some blue pretty represented, I'm going to say it's going to read as yellow. If I'm combining these fabrics, I'm not really emphasizing and seeing the shapes that I'm making with the fabrics because I'm getting a lot of blur because this blue is picking up this blue, is picking up this blue, so it's more soft, more blurred, more camouflaged. So if you're putting a lot of work into your piecing, these types of fabrics are going to camouflage your work. If you want your piecing to be camouflaged, then go ahead and pull a lot of fabrics. You notice that this color story that we're building here is starting to become chaotic. Your eyeball has no edges to see. It doesn't know where to stop and start. It doesn't know what shapes are being made. Just like camouflage, you're gonna like confuse your eye, like you're confusing a deer, because there's just a lot going on. Not to say that these aren't beautiful fabrics and they can't be used very successfully in a quilt, but you would want to create some definition, and you could do that by introducing a border color. So if I took like a neutral, so say I'm choosing for my neutral like a soft gray, a medium gray, or a white. You could use black, but for these blues, I would say maybe not. If I took these fabrics and I put something to give some structure and some resting place for my eyes and to create some delineation in between there, all of a sudden now I can see the contrast between this and this. So something like a stained glass quilt, you can use a lot of similar fabrics, let's say, of a lot of these sort of contrast eating fabrics in your stained glass, but you've got that little thin sashing in between that gives your eye structure, and it tells it where is the shape. So if you're gonna do the work of piecing and you insist on using larger scale, all over the place color scheme fabrics, or you could call them balanced. It's telling the whole color story on its own. So you can either find a fabric that's, this fabric is telling the blue part of the color story. And to get the full color story, I have to combine this with other fabrics. This fabric, it's telling the blue part of the color. It's telling the light part. It's telling the dark part. It's telling the red part. It's telling the yellow part. This is singing all the parts at once. So you can either choose a fabric that tells all the parts, or this one is going to stick to its own lane and it's going to sing its own line in the harmony, and you pair it with other fabrics to bring the harmony together. So this fabric is going to have a lot more contrast because it's clearly a specific note, and if you pair that against something, then you know where the edge is and you know how to go different from this. The more different things happening in a fabric, the harder it is to say this is opposite of that. So I know what's opposite of this, but if it's got a lot going on, what's opposite? Well, opposite of what part? Because it's already got a lot of texture going on in the fabric. All right, so we talked about balanced fabrics. The more that you're telling your whole color story in a single fabric, the harder it is to take something from that color story and create contrast. So this guy is definitely blue, and he contrasts everything that contrasts blue. He contrasts really light, he contrasts really dark. So we know how to use him as a team player. This guy is trying to do too much and be all over the place, so he's harder to contrast because of the number of colors, because of the scale of what's going on in here, and because it's got dark, it's got light, it's got medium. So I can't really contrast dark to light. I can't really contrast by hue because I got a lot of hues. And if I cut this in a small piece, it's sort of a grab bag of what I'm going to get to actually see. So my brain wants to say this is light blue, but I may actually cut a triangle that's pretty much black. And then whatever contrasts light blue is not necessarily contrasting black. So we got to talk about scale. We got to talk about balance. If you want contrast, you have to unbalance. You have to pick one from one side, one from the other side. So if all your fabrics are on both sides of the fence, how do you pick the opposite? Some quilts, like a two-color quilt, you've got your red and your white, or your blue and your white, or whatever your color scheme is. You've only got two groups to create. This quilt, you've got three groups. You have light, medium, and dark, and then you have three accent colors. So now I need to create contrast between three similar colors, three similar groups. So in this case, it's blue, light, medium, and dark. So the more groups you have that you want to have a distinction and see the distinction, the further apart, the more extreme your contrast needs to be. So this quilt would be beautiful with white and black and then a mid-gray. And then you've got enough distance between the groups that you can clearly tell, oh yeah, that fabric belongs in that group. If you're hemming and hawing over what group it goes in, then it doesn't have enough contrast to tell your piecing story. So if you're not sure, is this a light or a medium? And if you have 5 groups, if you have light, medium, dark, dark, that's even harder to create distinction, because the more groups, the closer together they're going to tend to blend. So if you want to create that separation, you have to be very strict and very severe about keeping them a little distance between so your eye can tell what group it belongs in. The more sort of smooth the fabric is. So here we've got 2 fabrics. The print is very small, it's very all over, it's very even. These are going to be easier fabrics to contrast than something that has a mixture of light and dark. Okay, so here we have 2 fabrics, and they are sort of eating the contrast in 2 ways. So we've got a pretty large scale print in both of them, and we're pulling quite a number of colors in both of them. However, when you look at it, there's more of a sense of being even and homogeneous in fabrics like this as compared to a fabric like this. You can get to medium by combining some light and some dark, but that's not as clear a contrast as having it more evenly medium. So you can kind of get away with it, but not as much. Let me see if I can find an example in this quilt behind me. So here we've got a dark solid and a medium solid. And even though these colors are fairly close, your eye has a clear sense of contrast between the 2. And then notice down here how the contrast is softened. So we've got a dark and we've got a medium. And both of these are made by a mixture of colors. So this medium doesn't really have any medium blue in it. It's got dark blue and light blue mixed together, and it sort of creates the muddled sense of medium, like overall this fabric is medium, but it's made by combining light and dark. And this is a much softer, more confusing contrast than this. So here we've got this dark fabric that's made, there's white in that, in this dark fabric. So that confuses and muddles the piecing. Whereas this one, using 2 solids, even though these are pretty close, you have a really crisp, clear idea. So this is going to tell your piecing story more clearly. This is going to soften it and confuse it. Now overall, if you are pretty strict and you keep your mixed groups far enough away from each other, you can still get the story, but it's not going to be as crisp. It's not going to pop as much. So let's take a look at, this is a medium red, but when you look closely, it contains dark red, it contains white, it contains light pink. So even though the overall impression of this fabric is medium, because it's creating medium from a mixture of lights and darks, it's not as clear and crisp a story. And it's not going to give you quite the same pop of contrast. Gotta bring it back. I'm not waiting out there for it.